What would you do if you were disrespected every day, but inside you held a secret that could change everything? What if the bullies thought you were weak, but in reality, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives? This is the story of Jalen Cole, a black boy who transferred to Brentwood High and quickly became the target of Brian Harper, the king of the school. They thought he was an easy target, but they had no idea that Jalen was not someone who could be easily defeated. The cruel jokes turned into violence, but when Jalen fought back, the whole school was shocked. A twist no one expected. A lesson Brian would never forget. Get ready for a story of justice, redemption, and the downfall of a bully. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Brentwood is a small town where it feels like nothing ever changes. Quiet streets, small roadside shops, and a community where everyone knows each other. Here, everyone is the same, not just in thought but also in skin color. So when Jalen Cole, a black boy, showed up at Brentwood High, he instantly became the center of attention. In this school, students of color were nearly non-existent, and if they were always on the outskirts. Jalen didn't care. He was used to it. His family had moved to Brentwood because of his mother's job, but from the moment he set foot here, he knew he didn't belong. On his first day, when he walked into the classroom, Jalen could feel the stares from everywhere. Some students whispered softly, others sneered. He chose a seat in the corner of the room, far from the gazes, keeping a safe distance. Not because he was shy, but because he knew he didn't need friends here. But it was his silence that attracted the wrong kind of attention, the kind that saw bullying as the school's rule. Brentwood High had its unspoken rules, and Jalen would soon learn them the hard way. Brentwood High doesn't have an official hierarchy of power, but everyone knows that the real rules of the place aren't set by the teachers or the administration. They are set by Brian Harper, the unspoken ruler of the school. As the son of the head football coach, Brian not only has the advantage of status, but also wields absolute influence over the students. He's the person everyone wants to be on the side of, or at least, no one dares to stand against. Brian doesn't operate alone. He's always surrounded by a loyal group of satellites, individuals willing to do whatever it takes to maintain the power they've built. Riley Cooper, Brian's sharp right-hand man, with a smirk that always carries a cruel irony, never directly engages but is always the one to initiate bullying with words as sharp as knives. Mason Doyle, a guy with bulging muscles but a head too dull to do anything other than punch and kick, is always the first to dive in when force is needed. Caleb Morgan, who takes pleasure in psychological manipulation, spreads rumors and stirs up gossip, turning victims into the laughingstock of the entire school. And lastly, Craig Walters, quiet but the most intimidating of the group. He never shows any emotion, never needs words to threaten anyone. He simply acts coldly and mercilessly. They are not your typical bullies. They are the ones who set the order of Brentwood High, deciding who gets to fit in, who lives on the margins, who can walk with their head held high, and who must walk with their head down silently whenever they pass through the halls. People like them don't just use punches or simple insults. They love to watch their victims gradually lose their self-confidence, pushed to the bottom of the food chain, turned into entertainment for the whole school. And when Jalen Cole arrives, he unknowingly signs himself up to be their target. A new student is supposed to flatter, try to fit in, and be careful not to upset the wrong people. But Jalen doesn't do that. He doesn't try to make friends, doesn't show fear or confusion, doesn't try to prove himself, doesn't show even the slightest hesitation under their scrutinizing gazes. He simply doesn't care, and that indifference bothers Brian and his group more than anything else. In their eyes, Jalen isn't someone worthy of respect, nor is he interesting enough to make friends with. He's the perfect prey, a kid with no one to protect him, a stranger to this town, a black boy in a sea of similar faces. And that means he will pay the price. The lunch that day was nothing special. Just the usual cold trays of food, groups of friends gathered according to the unspoken rules of the school. The sounds of laughter mingled with the clattering of forks and trays, and somewhere in the background, whispers about the new student. But amidst all the familiar things, there was something different, something that made some people uncomfortable, though they couldn't pinpoint why. Jalen Cole, sitting alone in the corner, quietly eating, completely uninterested in the world around him. No one sat with him, no one spoke to him, but no one saw him as out of place or awkward either. He simply existed, stood there like an invisible person in a world not meant for him. The way he kept his distance, the way he didn't seem to care about the scrutinizing gazes of others. All of it made him a paradox in the eyes of those who were used to defining the order of Brentwood High. At the table across the cafeteria, Brian Harper had been watching all of it. He wasn't the type to pay attention to people who didn't matter. But today, something felt off. Jalen wasn't like the other new students. Kids who moved to this town typically fell into two categories. Either they tried to fit in, seeking approval from the influential groups, or they were weak, easy prey from the moment they stepped foot in school. But Jalen didn't fit either category. He wasn't trying to make friends, nor did he appear scared or awkward. He simply didn't care. And that bothered Brian in a strange way. No one ignored him. No one could act like he didn't exist. At Brentwood High, he was the one who set the rules, the one who decided who could walk with their head held high, and who had to lower their gaze when passing through the hallways. And someone like Jalen, a black kid from out of town with no one to back him up, someone who dared to ignore his presence, couldn't exist without being punished. Brian pushed his tray away and stood up decisively. Riley, Mason, Caleb, and Craig immediately understood. No need for him to give orders. They stood up with him, forming a slow-moving wall as they made their way to the corner of the room where Jalen still sat, calm, as though the whole cafeteria didn't exist except for him. A loud bang echoed as Brian slammed his hand on the table, making Jalen's tray shake slightly. But he didn't flinch. Not a raised eyebrow. No awkwardness. No sign that he was surprised or upset. He simply continued eating, as if he was completely unaware of the 5 figures now standing before him. Brian leaned forward, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, intentionally so. "Don't see you on the football team," he said, pausing, narrowing his eyes at Jalen, as if sizing up his prey before making a move. "You know how to play, or are you just good at running?" A few laughs erupted from the nearby tables. Heads started to turn, attention shifting toward Jalen, but he still didn't respond. No forced smile, no embarrassment, no rebuttal. He just continued eating, his eyes remaining unnervingly calm. Riley, standing next to Brian, smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or maybe he doesn't speak English." Caleb chuckled, nudging Mason as though he'd heard a brilliant joke. Mason, as usual, laughed loudly, excited. Craig said nothing, but his gaze silently observed everything, ready to act if a fight broke out. And then, under the waiting eyes of everyone in the cafeteria, Jalen set down his fork, picked up his tray, stood up, and walked away, without saying a word, without a glance, without any sign that he felt offended or intimidated. The atmosphere shifted for a moment. Those who had been waiting for an argument, an angry response, or at least some sign of discomfort from Jalen were caught off guard. And a bit disappointed, the cafeteria fell silent for a brief second before murmurs began to rise. Brian watched Jalen's retreating figure, his eyes darkening. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He was used to controlling situations, to making people respond to him the way he wanted, through fear, submission, or anger. But Jalen had done none of that. He didn't know how to handle this situation. Riley crossed his arms and shook his head disdainfully. "Who does this guy think he is?" Mason raised an eyebrow, half joking, half serious. "I think he doesn't know the rules here." Caleb smirked, his voice tinged with amusement. "He's just trying to act different. But we all know guys like him are never really strong. They just need to be put in their place." Brian stood there, his eyes fixed on the door Jalen had just walked through. He no longer heard the voices of his friends around him. In his mind, a plan began to form. He wouldn't accept being ignored. He wouldn't allow anyone to walk around as though he didn't exist. And he sure as hell wouldn't let Jalen have peace here. If he wants to be different, Brian said slowly but with conviction, then I'll help him stand out. Riley chuckled, tilting his head at Brian. You got a plan? Brian didn't answer immediately. He just smiled slowly, a smile without warmth. And in that moment, Riley, Mason, Caleb, and Craig all knew that the game had officially begun. Brian wasn't the type to let an insult slide, especially when he was ignored in front of the entire cafeteria like he was invisible. Jalen might think he doesn't care about him, might think that staying quiet and avoiding confrontation would let him escape the grasp of Brentwood High. But Brian wasn't going to let that happen. He didn't just want to teach Jalen a lesson. He wanted to make him an example, a warning to anyone who dared challenge the order Brian had established. And like a patient predator, he began to tighten the noose, slowly eroding Jalen's self-respect, inch by inch, pushing him to react. It started with what seemed like accidental bumps. Jalen walked down the hall, always alone, with no one beside him, no one to stand up for him. Then one day, a hard shove into his shoulder made him stumble. When he turned around, Riley merely shrugged, smirking. Oh, sorry. Didn't see you there. The next day, as he opened his locker, a cup of water was dumped directly onto his books. The pages soaked, the ink blurred into a mess. Caleb stood a few steps away, whistling mockingly, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he watched the scene unfold. Jalen didn't react. He didn't furrow his brow, didn't glare, didn't rush to clean up the soggy mess like a beaten-down weakling. He just quietly took his books, shook the water off the covers, and walked away without a glance back. But that only made Brian's group angrier. Because to them, the victim had to show submission. The victim had to be scared, awkward, had to fight back weakly, and eventually accept their place in the food chain. But Jalen didn't. He walked down the hall like no one existed around him, like all the provocations were nothing more than a passing breeze. Brian gritted his teeth. He couldn't let this go on. He decided to take it up a notch. One day, rumors suddenly started spreading through the school. He got expelled for fighting. His parents moved here to escape trouble. I heard he almost killed someone once. Caleb took charge of this, whispering the stories to each small group, letting them spread and mutate into even scarier versions with every retelling. Within a week, people began to whisper as Jalen passed by, eyes wary, heads turning, conversations abruptly stopping when he came near. But even surrounded by the storm of rumors, Jalen didn't react. He didn't explain himself, didn't deny anything, didn't try to defend himself. He just kept walking through it all like a ghost, unbothered by the world. Brian started to feel something wasn't right. Every student who had been bullied had a breaking point. Some broke instantly. Some endured longer. But eventually, they cracked. But Jalen was different. Brian could sense it instinctively. There was something about him that wasn't like the others. He needed to test it. And he decided this time Jalen would have no choice but to react. That night, Jalen left the school library later than usual. He enjoyed the quiet of the place at night, where he could read without being disturbed, where he could focus on the pages instead of the gazes around him. But as he stepped outside the building, the atmosphere around him felt different. A heavy silence hung in the air. He felt it immediately. Footsteps, light, steady, but not of one person. Jalen didn't turn around immediately. He knew that once he turned, it would mean he acknowledged their presence. But when he reached the intersection near the sports field, he stopped. Not because he was scared, but because he knew this was bound to happen sooner or later. You think you can keep ignoring us? Brian's voice came from behind, low, but mocking. As Jalen slowly turned, he saw Brian, Riley, Mason, Caleb, and Craig blocking his way. Their faces clearly showed their intentions. He had been cornered. Don't worry. No one's here to witness this, Riley said, his voice almost cheerful, as if this was just a game everyone had to play. Mason cracked his knuckles and stepped forward. "Just a little chat. No one wants things to get tense, right?" Jalen didn't answer. He just looked at Brian, calm, neither surprised nor scared. That only made Brian more frustrated. "You're going to learn to respect us." Brian stepped closer, leaning down to look Jalen in the eye. But just as he took a step forward, Jalen gently tilted his head, a small but purposeful movement, as if he were assessing the situation, as if he were weighing his options. Brian suddenly realized this was the first time Jalen had really looked him in the eye, and in that moment, he felt something wasn't right. Jalen's eyes held no fear, no sign of weakness, nothing but a dangerous calm. And then, before anyone could react, everything changed. In an instant, Jalen moved faster than anyone in Brian's group could imagine. Before Mason could even throw a punch, Jalen spun around and twisted his wrist in a precise lock. Mason screamed, crumpling to the ground in pain, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Brian's eyes widened in shock. What the hell just happened? Jalen stood there, still holding his calm demeanor, as if what had just happened was nothing out of the ordinary. He exhaled softly, then said for the first time ever, "I've been trying to avoid this, but you're not worth me being afraid of." The atmosphere in the alley became thick, as if something invisible was pressing down on the air. There were no more laughs, no more loud taunts like usual, only 5 figures surrounding Jalen, their eyes gleaming with a mix of aggression and anticipation. Brian stood at the center, his face calm, but there was a cold hint of amusement in his gaze. "Listen, kid. No one's going to help you here." Brian took a step forward, his voice not loud, but enough to make one thing clear. This was not a chance encounter, but a warning, a carefully staged event, not to tease like in the cafeteria, not to play around like in the hallways, but to settle an unresolved issue. Jalen sighed lightly, not out of fear, but because he knew this moment would come sooner or later. He had tried to take the path of silence, tried not to pay attention to the provocations, tried to walk as if they didn't exist. But the problem with people like Brian was that they didn't want to be ignored. He didn't just want to teach Jalen a lesson, he wanted to see him afraid, to see him submit, to see him look at him as if he controlled everything. But Jalen would never do that. He looked around, fully aware of his situation. There was no one nearby. The shops on this street had closed early. The yellow street lamps cast faint, diffused light onto the road, elongating the distorted shadows of Brian's group on the sidewalk. 5 of them, all waiting for a reaction, like wolves circling their prey. Mason, the most impulsive of the group, was the first to act. He stepped forward, grabbed Jalen by the collar, yanked him hard, forcing him to look into his eyes. The first mistake. The moment Mason's hand made contact, Jalen moved. No warning, no sign. In the blink of an eye, he tilted his body, twisted Mason's wrist behind him with a smooth lock, and at the same time snapped his wrist with a precise twist, causing him to scream in pain. Before anyone could react, Jalen used the momentum to pull sharply, lowering his center of gravity and slamming Mason to the pavement so fast he didn't even understand what had happened. The sound of Mason's body hitting the sidewalk echoed sharply in the quiet air. Brian's eyes widened, frozen for a brief moment. Riley paused, no longer wearing his usual mocking grin. Caleb instinctively took a step back, his eyes now alert, because what had just happened was nothing like the typical school fight. Craig, the quietest in the group, was the only one to maintain his composure. But there was a clear shift in his gaze, a newfound caution. Mason rolled on the ground, groaning in pain, clutching his trembling wrist. He couldn't understand why, in just a split second, he had gone from being the aggressor to lying on the ground completely controlled by the very person he thought was the prey. Brian squinted, his gaze darkening. This was not what he had expected. He had thought Jalen was just stubborn, that he stayed silent, out of fear, that he refused to react because he didn't know what else to do. But the moment just now proved that Jalen wasn't afraid of them. had never been afraid. And perhaps it was Jalen who had chosen to hold back, not the weakling who couldn't fight back. And that made Brian feel uneasy. Jalen stood up, not in a hurry, not showing any tension after what had just happened. He took a slow breath, as if everything was still under control. Then he spoke for the first time since the provocation began. "I tried to avoid this." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces all fixated on him, then continued, his voice calm, but with an underlying coldness. "But you're not worth me being afraid of." Brian felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't like this. He didn't like how Jalen spoke as if he and his group were nothing. He didn't like the calmness in his eyes. He didn't like the quiet confidence that didn't need to be flaunted. And most importantly, he didn't like the feeling that he was losing control. Riley glanced at Brian, as if waiting for a signal. Mason was still on the ground, while Caleb and Craig remained on high alert. The group could feel the atmosphere shifting. Jalen was no longer the prey they thought he was, but instead, he could be a dangerous predator they had never faced before. Brian clenched his fists, but instead of ordering an attack, he did something even he hadn't expected. He stepped back. Though it was just a small movement, Riley and Caleb noticed, and they understood what it meant. Jalen noticed as well, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there calmly, observing, as if waiting to see what Brian would do next. No one spoke for a few seconds that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, Brian broke the silence, his voice now eerily calm. "This isn't over." He shot Jalen a cold, knife-like look, then turned and gestured for Riley and Caleb to help Mason up. Craig, as always, silently followed. Jalen watched them walk away, but in his heart, he knew Brian wasn't the type to simply give up like this. Tonight's encounter was just the beginning, and though Jalen didn't want to, he knew he had just stepped into a battle he couldn't avoid. The next morning, no official announcement was needed for anyone to know that something had just changed at Brentwood High. The news spread faster than any rumor ever could, an obvious truth that no one could ignore or distort. Jalen Cole had knocked Mason Doyle out with a single punch. It wasn't a long, drawn-out fight, nor a fair one-on-one brawl, but a single strike so quick that the witnesses didn't even have time to understand what had happened. Mason didn't just fall down. He was completely taken down without a chance to fight back. And most importantly, Jalen wasn't scared. The students in the school buzzed with gossip, stories exaggerated in their own unique ways. Some said Jalen had been part of a gang. Others speculated he had military training. And some even spun wild tales about him beating an entire group of adults with his bare hands. No matter which rumors were true or false, one undeniable fact remained. Jalen was not someone who could be easily bullied, but that very fact made him even more mysterious. Those who had once seen him as an outsider now watched him with caution. Those who once laughed when they saw him being harassed now quietly observed from afar. His silence, once a sign of weakness, now carried an almost invisible threat. However, not everyone accepted this as an interesting story to gossip about. Mr. Russell, the history teacher at Brentwood High, had been around long enough to know that something deeper was going on. He had taught at this school for over 20 years, witnessed countless groups of students grow up, seen many bullies, and seen many students become victims. But Jalen Cole was different from anyone he had encountered before. It wasn't just the calmness he maintained when facing Brian and his crew, or the way he accepted isolation without showing any sign of distress, but the way he moved. When he heard about the incident the night before, he wasn't surprised. He had noticed Jalen from the first day the boy stepped into his class, not because he was one of the rare black students in an almost all-white town, but because he carried himself in a way that was very different from the others. He wasn't just another new student trying to survive. He was observing. And more than anyone, Mr. Russell knew how to recognize someone trained to fight. So when he saw Jalen sitting alone in the library during lunch, he decided to approach. He pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his calm gaze filled with genuine concern. "I've seen the way you move," Jalen didn't look up immediately. He turned a page in his book, eyes still fixed on the words before him. But when Mr. Russell didn't leave, Jalen realized this man wasn't like the others. Finally, he set the book down and looked up at the older teacher, a hidden weariness in his gaze. "Where did you learn that?" Jalen paused for a moment. This wasn't the first time he had been asked this question, but instead of avoiding it or changing the subject, he decided to tell the truth, because he knew this man wouldn't be easily fooled. "My dad used to be a professional fighter." The words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. Mr. Russell nodded slowly, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Now he understood. Jalen wasn't fearless because he didn't know fear. He was fearless because he had been trained to control it. It wasn't the recklessness of kids who liked to fight in school. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of, and more importantly, knew when not to do anything at all. "So you've been trained," Mr. Russell said, his voice thoughtful, as though evaluating something. "I'm guessing it's not just a few basic self-defense moves." Jalen didn't confirm or deny. He simply held that same steady gaze, calm, unshaken. "Do you understand what this means?" "Mr." Russell leaned forward, his tone no longer that of a teacher interrogating a student, but of someone who had seen enough mistakes to know that some paths led to consequences that couldn't be undone. "I know Brian and his group won't let this slide. I also know you have the ability to stand up to them. But the issue isn't what you can do, it's what you'll choose to do." Jalen's expression didn't change, but deep down, he understood what Mr. Russell was trying to say. Strength wasn't the issue. The issue was how to use it, and he knew that once he crossed that line, there would be no going back. But would Brian stop? He wasn't sure, and if not, what would he do? Outside the library, just a few steps away, someone else was also listening to this conversation. Brian Harper stood against the wall near the window, every word from Jalen and Mr. Russell sinking into the deepest corners of his mind. When he heard the three words, "professional fighter," his breath hitched. He had thought Jalen was just a stubborn kid, a student with a bit of courage. But now he realized he had completely misjudged him. Jalen wasn't some weakling who suddenly fought back. He was a predator, trained to control his instincts. And that made Brian angrier than ever. He couldn't let this go on. He couldn't let the whole school think he had been defeated. He wouldn't accept this ending. Not like this. And in that moment, a plan began to form in his mind. A plan not just for revenge, but to put Jalen in a position where he couldn't escape. Because if Jalen wanted to play the patience game, Brian would force him to choose between standing still and acting. And he knew exactly how to make that happen. Brian couldn't bear the humiliation. He had always been the victor, not because he was stronger than everyone else, but because he knew how to control the game, how to break others' confidence before they had a chance to fight back. But this time, things hadn't gone the way he wanted. He had expected a frightened Jalen, a Jalen cornered, a Jalen desperately begging for forgiveness. Instead, he faced a Jalen standing tall, a Jalen calm, as if this was no big deal, a Jalen making him feel like he was the one being threatened. And the worst part was, everyone had seen it. The whole school was talking about how Brian Harper and his group had been defeated, not by a fair fight, but by the undeniable truth that Jalen was stronger, that he couldn't break him, that he had lost. He could feel the change in the way people looked at him. Those who once looked at him with respect now gave him doubtful glances, as if they were reassessing whether he was still the king of Brentwood High. He couldn't let this continue. He had to take back control, and the moment he overheard the conversation between Jalen and Mr. Russell, an idea formed in his mind, a plan not just for revenge, but to make sure Jalen couldn't keep avoiding him. Brian started spreading rumors. At first, he told just a few people, but like all rumors, once you plant a small seed in the right spot, it spreads like wildfire through dry woods. "Jalen is just a coward. If he's really that good, why doesn't he fight me? He only knows how to sneak attack when no one's watching. If he was really tough, why doesn't he face me like a man? Maybe he just got lucky." Or maybe he's only strong when facing someone like Mason. Brian didn't need to say much. He just needed to plant an idea in their heads, and they'd turn it into the truth. As the students heard these rumors, they began to question things themselves. Yeah, why didn't Jalen fight Brian? If he was really that good? If he truly wasn't afraid of anyone, why didn't he stand up and prove it? Those questions started to spread, from whispers in the hallways to murmurs in the cafeteria. Just the day before, Jalen had been the hero. Students had looked at him with admiration, but now, he was the one they doubted. Brian had changed the story. Now Jalen wasn't the one who had beaten Brian. He was the one avoiding a fair fight. No longer the strong one, but the coward hiding. When Jalen entered the cafeteria that noon, he felt the shift immediately. No more admiring looks like yesterday. No more wary glances. Instead, there were quick, doubtful stares. Whispers that followed him as he walked by. Heads turning away hastily when he glanced back. Caleb, always wanting to make things more dramatic, just happened to walk past Jalen's table and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I guess some people are only tough when no one's looking." Riley immediately chimed in. "Or maybe they're only tough against Mason. You know Mason's not exactly the brightest." Laughter erupted around them. Jalen stayed silent, but he didn't need to say anything. He could feel what was happening. He wasn't new to manipulation like this. He knew exactly what Brian was trying to do. Brian was forcing him to show his hand. He wanted to turn their battle into something inevitable. He wanted to turn Jalen from a victor into a coward, someone who would have to stand up and defend his honor by stepping into a fight Brian had already set up. Jalen looked to the far end of the cafeteria. Brian was sitting there, arms crossed, watching him with a smug grin. He had been pulled into this game. Jalen knew that if he kept ignoring it, the rumors would only spread further. If he kept silent, people would think Brian was right. If he refused the fight, not only would he lose respect, but he'd also put himself in a weak position. Brian had set a trap, and Jalen knew that the only way to destroy that trap was to face it head-on. But the question was he ready to do it his way? Or would he get sucked into Brian's? Jalen could beat Brian. That was never the issue. But winning a fight didn't mean winning a war. And he needed to think carefully before stepping into the game Brian had laid out. Brian couldn't let the rumor grow on its own. He needed to control it. Shape it in the most beneficial way for himself. People like him never let things get out of hand. And this time was no different. He needed one final move to corner Jalen, forcing him to choose between fighting or accepting eternal humiliation. He had been planning this moment all day, and that afternoon he made it happen. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, instead of letting everyone scatter as usual, Brian stepped into the middle of the sports field. Students were still hanging around before heading home, and loudly he declared to the crowd, "Listen up, everyone." His voice rang out confidently, drawing the attention of those around him. Within seconds, the entire schoolyard was focused on him. As expected, Caleb, Riley, Mason, and Craig quickly spread the news, pulling more people in. Brian folded his arms across his chest, scanning the crowd with complete control. "We all heard about what happened last night. We all heard about Jalen Cole, the guy who took down Mason with one punch." A few murmurs spread through the crowd. Mason stood at the edge, fists clenched but saying nothing, still feeling the humiliation from last time. Brian continued, his voice shifting to a challenging tone. "But if he's that good, why is he avoiding me?" The air fell still for a few seconds. Brian narrowed his eyes, looking around the crowd. Then deliberately, he raised his voice, making sure everyone could hear. "If Jalen is really as strong as everyone says, why doesn't he dare face me? Or is he only good at sneaking attacks in the dark?" Whispers began to spread. Eyes searched for Jalen in the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked confused. But everyone understood. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was becoming a reality. Brian shifted his gaze forward. And then he saw Jalen standing not far away, as calm as ever. No sign of surprise, no anger, just observing. All eyes turned to Jalen. Brian squinted, smirking, and then threw out his final decisive blow. "If Jalen won't fight me, then we all know he's just a liar." Silence. Complete silence. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one even breathed heavily. Everyone waited for Jalen's response. And then, after a brief but tense moment, Jalen stepped forward. He walked slowly, unhurried, not swept up in the storm Brian had just created. When he stopped in front of him, their eyes locked, an unspoken confrontation where the weaker one would be exposed. But instead of getting angry, instead of explaining himself, instead of justifying his silence over the past days, Jalen simply spoke, his voice low and clear. "I don't fight people weaker than me." An invisible wave spread through the crowd. His words were like a sharp knife cutting through the air, leaving a deadly tension behind. Brian felt his body stiffen, as if he'd been punched in the stomach before he was ready. Everything was silent for 2 long seconds. Then a burst of whispers erupted. Riley blinked, unable to believe what he had just heard. Caleb turned to Mason, mouth agape, while Craig furrowed his brows, for the first time showing a hint of surprise. Brian had never been spoken to like that in front of the whole school. His whole life, he had been the image of dominance, someone no one dared challenge. But now, right in the middle of the open, right in front of everyone, he had just been called weak. And worse, Jalen didn't say it as a joke. He said it like it was an obvious truth, as if Brian wasn't even worth the effort. For the first time in his life, Brian lost control. No more smug smiles. No more quiet confidence. No more composure of someone who always holds his ground. He felt his fists clench, his heart pounding in his chest, anger flaring up like a fire he couldn't put out. He had been humiliated, in front of everyone, in front of the whole school. If he didn't do something right now, from this moment on he would no longer be the one in control. Without thinking, without planning, without hesitation, he swung his fist at Jalen, but he never hit him. Before the punch could get close, Jalen tilted his head to the side, a gentle but perfectly precise movement. Brian's fist missed the air, and in that moment of imbalance, he felt his arm being grabbed. Then he lost complete control. Jalen didn't hit him. He simply pulled lightly, using Brian's own momentum, sending him stumbling forward with no way to control himself. Jalen released his grip at the perfect moment, and Brian staggered, losing all balance. He fell, right in front of the entire school. Laughter erupted, not from one person, not from 2 people, but from the whole crowd. Jalen didn't need to hit him. He just let Brian destroy himself. Brian lay on the ground, his pride shattered with every laugh that echoed across the schoolyard. And this time, he knew that this was something he couldn't control anymore. Brian couldn't let this slide. He had lived his whole life as a controller, a predator at the top of the food chain, someone no one dared challenge. But in just a few brief seconds on the schoolyard, his image had been completely destroyed. Jalen had not only embarrassed him, but had done it in the most ruthless way, making him fall, turning him into a joke in front of the entire school. And worse, Jalen didn't even need to hit him. It was all just a small movement, perfect control, utter calmness. And Brian had been brought down in front of everyone. Brian had never felt this angry before. From that day on, everything changed. No one avoided his gaze anymore. No more hesitant nods from the other students. No more quiet respect he once thought was forever. Now people looked at him differently, no longer with fear, but with contempt. Brian knew he couldn't reclaim his honor with mind games anymore. This time, he would end it the oldest, most primal way. No tricks, no tactics, just pure violence. And he had a plan. That night, Jalen walked toward the school's bike rack, where he usually parked his old bicycle. The air was unnaturally still. The streetlights cast faint, dim light on the ground, stretching distorted shadows. In the atmosphere, there was something strange, an invisible tension creeping into every breath. Jalen sensed it immediately. He slowed to a stop, not turning around, but his shoulders tensed for a brief moment. Footsteps, quiet, careful, but not subtle enough to avoid the ears trained to sense danger, like Jalen's. He didn't need to turn around to know who was there. "You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone? With no consequences?" Brian's voice rang out from behind, low and full of fury. Jalen didn't answer right away. He just took a slow breath, as if weighing his options. He could try to reason with him. He could ignore it and walk away. But from the tone of Brian's voice, from how he was holding his anger back in every word, Jalen knew Brian had already decided that tonight wasn't going to end peacefully. So when he slowly turned around, his expression was no longer indifferent. Brian and Riley stood there, both looking tense, but also ready to do anything to regain control. "You really want to do this?" Jalen asked, his voice devoid of threat, simply a question. Brian clenched his fists, his eyes burning with the fire of wounded pride. "You have no other choice." Then he lunged. Brian threw a powerful punch, aimed directly at Jalen's face with all his might. But before the blow could land, Jalen moved. No rush, no panic, just perfect precision. He turned his head to the side, letting the punch skim his cheek. And before Brian had a chance to retract his arm, Jalen countered. He kicked straight into Brian's stomach. The kick didn't need to be that hard. It just needed to be at the right time, in the right place. And instantly, Brian was pushed back. Gasping for breath from the unexpected force, he was sent sprawling, stumbling into a nearby parked car, coughing violently from the loss of air. Riley didn't wait for Brian to get back up. He charged in, thinking he could take advantage of Jalen being focused on Brian to attack from behind. But Jalen had anticipated that. In just a second, he spun around, his right hand catching Riley's wrist just as he threw a punch. Riley didn't have time to react. Jalen twisted his wrist at an angle to reduce the force of the blow, then yanked hard, using Riley's momentum to slam him down onto the ground. A heavy thud echoed as Riley's back hit the concrete. Pain coursed through his body immediately. Brian, now having regained his breath, his eyes wide in disbelief, saw Riley sprawled on the ground, groaning from the fall. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that once again Jalen had controlled the entire situation. Jalen didn't stand there to taunt, didn't make a show of challenging him. He simply stood upright, looking down at Brian with complete calmness, as if everything that had just happened was an event he had already known the outcome of, as if Brian had never had a chance from the start. Brian's humiliation was deeper than ever before. This time, he hadn't just lost in front of the whole school. He had lost, even when no one was watching, with no one for him to blame, no one to make excuses to. He had been defeated completely, in the most literal sense, and that drove him crazier than anything else. Brian knew he couldn't keep charging at Jalen and expect a different result. The last two times, he had thought that his strength and authority would overpower his opponent. But both times, not only did he lose, but he was also humiliated in the worst possible way. Jalen wasn't the type of person he could intimidate with threats or reckless punches, and that made him angrier than anything else. The problem wasn't that Jalen was stronger than him. The problem was that Jalen didn't see him as a threat. That drove Brian crazy. This time, he knew he had to change tactics. If one-on-one couldn't take Jalen down, he wouldn't let the fight unfold that way. He needed to create a situation where no matter how fast, strong, or smart Jalen was, he wouldn't be able to win. He spent the next day gathering a team, not cowards who only knew how to provoke from afar, but people who could actually cause damage. Jack Kramer, the wrestling team captain, known for his massive build and opponent control skills. Dylan Lee, a hothead who had been suspended multiple times for brawling. Zane Turner, the quietest, but also the most dangerous, because he never fought without a reason, and once he engaged, he wouldn't stop until his opponent couldn't stand anymore. Brian spun a story that Jalen had embarrassed all the athletes in school, and that if they didn't teach him a lesson, sooner or later he'd disrespect them the way he had disrespected him. It didn't take long for the group to agree. He sent Jalen a short, blunt message. No pretenses, no hidden agendas. Meet me after school, 5 p.m. A real fight. You have no choice. He didn't have to wait long for a response. All right. No fuss, no questions, no sign of hesitation. Brian gripped his phone tightly, his eyes gleaming with malice. This time, Jalen wouldn't win. When the clock struck exactly 5 p.m., the sky had already started to turn a faint orange, stretching shadows across the ground. At the back of the school, the emptiest spot. No teachers, no witnesses. Just an empty, dirty yard with withered grass and old concrete walls. The perfect place for a confrontation no one could stop. Brian walked forward with his team, Jack and Dylan on either side like two walls of muscle, Riley and Zane following closely behind, forming a lineup that anyone could tell wasn't an even match, but a premeditated slaughter. He felt his confidence return, that sense of power that had once been a natural part of him, a feeling Jalen had stripped away from him over the past days. This time, no one could save him. No one could help him escape this trap. But then, as he and his crew stepped into the yard, he saw Jalen standing there, waiting. He wasn't sitting, wasn't leaning against a wall, didn't look like someone who was cornered. He stood tall, hands in his pockets, his gaze calm, as if this was just another normal afternoon. No fear, no hesitation, only a calmness that made Brian feel uncomfortable to his core. He tried not to let the confusion show on his face, but deep down, he knew Jalen had known this was going to happen, and he still showed up. No allies, no weapons, no reason to believe he could win, but he still showed up. And for a brief moment, Brian felt something he never thought he would feel before Jalen. Worry. But he quickly pushed it away, focusing on what was about to happen. He smirked, took a step forward, and looked Jalen straight in the eye. This time, there's no escape. Jalen just shrugged, as if Brian had said something utterly ridiculous. Do you really think I need an escape? The words hit Brian's mind like a knife, because they weren't an empty challenge. Not a statement to sound tough. It was the truth. Jalen had no reason to run. He had no reason to be scared. And that made Brian feel more uneasy than ever. But now wasn't the time to doubt. He had come here to finish everything. And he would do it, no matter what. He looked at Jack, giving a slow nod. No words, no complicated plans. Jack understood right away. Without waiting another second, Jack lunged forward, delivering a powerful opening strike. Jalen didn't move right away. He just stood there, observing, as if evaluating the situation, as if knowing the real fight hadn't even begun. And when Jack's punch was almost upon him, Jalen moved. Quick as the wind, precise as a machine. And then everything changed instantly. Jack charged forward, a towering figure, like a predator, his fist swinging with all his might, aiming straight at Jalen with the intent to end the fight with a single blow. He was not like Brian or Riley, who thrived on taunting and threatening words. Jack was a fighter. He didn't talk much. He simply believed no one could stand against him in a one-on-one fight. But there was one thing he didn't know. Jalen never fought one-on-one. As Jack's punch came toward him, Jalen didn't back down. He stepped forward. The moment happened so fast that the onlookers couldn't even tell what had just occurred. As Jack thought his fist was about to hit Jalen's face, Jalen had already disappeared from his original position, crouched low, smoothly twisting his body to the side. By the time Jack realized what had happened, it was too late. Jalen spun, sweeping his leg straight into Jack's knee. Jack collapsed instantly, feeling a sharp pain shoot up his leg. But Jalen didn't stop there. In the same motion, he grabbed Jack's arm, yanked it forward, and used his own weight to throw him to the ground. A loud thud rang out as Jack's heavy body slammed against the concrete. He lay motionless for a few seconds, eyes wide, unable to believe what had just happened. Jalen never slowed down. The moment Jack hit the ground, Caleb lunged in, trying to take advantage of the brief moment Jalen was still dealing with another opponent. He swung a punch, but Jalen had already anticipated it. Jalen didn't wait for the punch to come close. He stepped forward forcefully, swiping Caleb's wrist aside, then rammed his shoulder straight into Caleb's chest. Caleb was knocked back, stumbling off balance, and just before he could regain his footing, Jalen delivered a spinning kick to his side, making him bend over and collapse to the ground, groaning in pain. Riley and Dylan witnessed the entire scene. And at that moment, both of them understood that this was not a fight they could win. Dylan, known for his hot temper and aggression, stood frozen, his eyes locked on Jalen. Riley didn't need to think twice. He turned and fled. Seeing this, Dylan also lost the courage to continue. The two remaining men ran out of the backyard, leaving Brian standing alone. Jalen slowly turned his head. His gaze now no longer cold or angry. It was simply calm. As if what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. He stepped forward, one step at a time, the sound of his shoes echoing loudly on the quiet concrete. Brian swallowed hard. He had always been the one in control. He had always been the one on top, the one setting the rules, the one deciding who was allowed to exist in the small world of Brentwood High. But now, as he looked at Jalen, he no longer felt in control of anything. Everything he had once believed in, power, the fear he instilled in others, his ability to manipulate people into submission, had been completely shattered in one afternoon. Jalen stood before him without saying a word. Brian felt his heart pounding in his chest, each breath heavy as if the air around him was squeezing him tighter. He could try to attack, but after what he had just witnessed, he knew it would be pointless. Jalen had won. Not just because he was stronger, but because Jalen had never feared him from the beginning. In that moment, for the first time in his life, Brian truly felt small. Jalen tilted his head, looking at him, as if waiting to see what he would do next. But Brian did nothing. He no longer had the strength to resist, no more pride to keep fighting. He had lost, and this time there was no hiding it. Brian stood there, his chest heaving with each heavy breath. He had no choice left. Jalen had taken down each one of them, not only with strength but with absolute calmness, a level of control Brian had never seen before. He clenched his fists, cold sweat running down his spine. Every cell in his body screamed that he had to do something, anything, to regain his power. But he knew he had been completely defeated. Jalen stood there, his eyes on Brian with no pity, no contempt, and no sign of enjoying the victory. He just looked at him as if finally seeing the true person behind the facade. Not a ruler, not the strong one, but just an arrogant kid who had just realized that he no longer held the power he once believed he had. Jalen didn't need to fight. He didn't need to end this with a punch or a kick, because Brian had already fallen on his own. Jalen just looked at him for a moment, then turned and walked away, saying nothing. In that moment, everything froze. No sound, no words. Nothing but the heavy silence that Brian could feel in every fiber of his being. But then, from somewhere, a round of applause erupted. At first it was one person, then two, then the whole crowd. Before Brian could comprehend what was happening, the entire courtyard stood up clapping loudly, as if they had just witnessed something far more important than a mere fight. They weren't applauding because Jalen had won. They were applauding because the ruler had been overthrown. Brian didn't dare look back, but he could feel every gaze directed at him. No longer were there looks of fear, no more false respect, only contempt, smug satisfaction, and worst of all, indifference. He was no longer the one everyone feared. He was just a defeated man. Jalen kept walking, not needing to look back, because he knew this was over. Not because he had beaten Brian, but because he had taken away the one thing Brian cherished most, his power. Brian stood there, alone, in the middle of a crowd that had erupted in celebration. And for the first time in his life, he was no longer the center of this world. The next morning, when the school bell rang to signal the start of a new school day, everyone realized that Brentwood High had changed. The mocking laughter of Brian and his group was no longer echoing through the halls. There were no longer scenes of students being shoved into lockers or walking with their heads down in fear. No one was being bullied anymore. Brian didn't show up. No one spoke of him directly. But everyone understood that what had happened after school the day before had put an end to his reign. There were no more fearful looks when his name was mentioned. No more reluctant nods from students who had once been intimidated by him. Brian had become a thing of the past, and Brentwood High was moving forward without him. The ones who had stood behind him, Riley, Mason, Caleb, had also disappeared from their usual spots. No one saw them as threats anymore, and no one cared to stand by their side. They had lost the one thing that gave them value, Brian's dominance. And most importantly, there were no more racial slurs, the sarcastic remarks, the hushed whispers, the cold, judging stares. Everything had vanished as if they had never existed. Not because Brentwood High had become a perfect place, but because no one had the courage to say those things anymore. Because they knew that if anyone dared to try, Jalen Cole was still there. Still calm as ever, and no one wanted to test his limits again. But Jalen didn't care about his newfound reputation. He didn't walk the halls with smugness, didn't enjoy the admiring glances or whispers of respect. He wasn't concerned with becoming someone everyone respected or feared. He had never fought to become someone at Brentwood. He just wanted to live peacefully. He still chose to sit at the same table in the cafeteria, still didn't initiate conversations with anyone, still walked silently down the hallways. But his silence was no longer misunderstood as weakness. Now that silence was a sign of strength, a warning that Brentwood High had changed. Anyone wanting to return to the old ways would have to face the reality that the world Brian Harper once controlled no longer existed. A week passed, and Brentwood High continued to operate in a new rhythm, one without Brian Harper and the repression he once imposed on the place. People began to get used to a different reality, one in which no one had to bow their head in fear while walking through the halls, one in which no one had to hesitate before those who once thought they had the right to decide who deserved respect and who did not. But even though Brentwood had changed, one person still had not truly faced the truth: Brian Harper. Since that day, he had nearly disappeared. No more arrogant words, no more challenging glares, no more of his familiar presence in the usual corners of the school grounds. Brian was no longer the Brian he once was, and he knew that. For an entire week, he struggled with himself, trying to understand what had really caused his defeat. It wasn't because Jalen was stronger. He had accepted that truth. It wasn't because he lost control. He also understood that the power he once held was nothing more than a fragile illusion. He lost because he was wrong from the start. For the first time in his life, he realized that the fear he had once instilled wasn't real strength. Real strength lies in controlling oneself, not in controlling others. And Jalen, despite having had hundreds of opportunities to bring him down, did not do so. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to trample Brian to feel stronger. Jalen didn't fight out of hatred. He only fought to protect himself. And that made Brian feel smaller than all the times he had been defeated. A week later, on a late afternoon, Brian found Jalen in the back of the school, the place where everything had ended, and also where he knew he had to face the truth. Jalen stood there as usual, quietly and calmly, as if nothing in the world could affect him. Brian walked up, no longer arrogant, no longer pretending to be strong. He took a deep breath, then said the two words he never thought he would say to anyone: "I was wrong." The words came out easier than he expected, but carried a weight he had never felt before. Jalen looked at him, his expression unchanged, with no contempt, no sense of triumph. He simply nodded. No long speeches, no accusations, no moral lectures, just a nod, as if Jalen had known long ago that this day would come. Brian didn't know how to feel about it, but as he turned and walked away, he felt a little lighter, as though he had finally taken off a burden he had placed on himself for so many years. Jalen also turned and walked in the opposite direction. No one said anything more. No one needed to say anything more. But from that day forward, everything at Brentwood truly changed. Not just because the bully had fallen, but because the entire school had learned a lesson no one could forget. Brentwood High was no longer the same. Brian's reign had collapsed, and the fear he had once spread disappeared with it. But this story wasn't just about a battle between a bully and someone brave enough to stand up against him. It was about real strength, not lying in violence, but in how we control ourselves. Jalen didn't win with fists. He won with patience, control, and most importantly, with not letting hatred define who he was. The days that followed Brian's downfall unfolded in a rhythm almost too quiet for a school that had once thrived on fear. The hallways of Brentwood High, once echoing with cruel laughter, shoves into lockers, and whispered insults, had become strangely ordinary. For the first time in years, students walked with their heads lifted, conversations flowing freely, without the constant tension of wondering who might be watching. And yet, amid that silence, Jalen Cole remained the same. He still took his seat at the back corner of the cafeteria, still kept his tray balanced neatly, his eyes often focused on the book he carried with him, still walked through the corridors without urgency, his hands at his sides, his gaze calm. The difference wasn't in Jalen's habits, it was in the way people looked at him. Where once his silence had marked him as weak, now it shimmered like a shield. Every step he took seemed to remind the others of what they had witnessed, that strength wasn't loud or boastful, that dignity didn't need applause. Some students admired him quietly, others still whispered, and a few even wished to befriend him. But Jalen never sought any of that. His goal had never been to be seen as a hero. He wanted only what he had wanted from the beginning: peace. Brian Harper, meanwhile, was a ghost of his former self. He still came to school, though far less frequently. When he did, his presence no longer commanded the cafeteria or the courtyard. The throne he had once built on fear and submission had vanished, leaving him to wander among the very students who used to avoid his gaze. For an entire week, he spoke to no one. His friends, Riley, Mason, Caleb, and Craig, had long since drifted away, their loyalty having been tied to the power he no longer possessed. And Brian, for the first time, felt what it meant to be ordinary. It gnawed at him in ways the defeats themselves had not. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together how a life built on dominance could crumble in a matter of days. He realized then what Jalen had shown him, not with fists, but with restraint, that control over others was never real strength. Control over oneself was. 1 week later, on a late afternoon, Brian found himself drawn back to the place where everything had ended, the rear courtyard of the school. The fading sun painted the cracked concrete in amber hues, and the faint wind stirred the dry grass along the edges. And there, as if summoned by the very air itself, Jalen stood. Calm, quiet, his hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, as though nothing in the world could disturb him. For a long moment, Brian only watched him. The boy he had once called an enemy, the one he had sought to break, stood unbroken before him. There was no smugness in Jalen's posture, no arrogance in his stance, only a stillness that Brian could neither imitate nor understand. Finally, Brian walked forward. His steps were slower than they used to be, lacking the swagger that had once defined him. He stopped a few feet away, drew in a sharp breath, and spoke the words he had never believed he could say. I was wrong. The admission hung in the air, fragile and heavy all at once. For Brian, those 2 words carried the weight of years, the arrogance of his youth, the cruelty of his actions, the humiliation of his defeat. He had expected them to choke in his throat, but instead, they slid out more easily than any insult he had ever thrown. Jalen looked at him then. His expression was unchanged. No contempt, no triumph, no hint of gloating. He simply met Brian's gaze, as if measuring the truth in his voice. Then, with a single nod, Jalen acknowledged it. No long speeches, no accusations, no lectures, just a nod, as if he had known all along that this day would come. Brian felt something loosen inside him, a burden he hadn't realized he had been carrying. And though his pride still ached, though his past could not be undone, in that moment he felt lighter than he had in years. The 2 boys turned then, each walking in opposite directions. No one else was there to see it. No applause erupted from the shadows. No rumors sprang up the next morning. It was not a public spectacle like their battles had been. It was private, human, final, and perhaps that was how it was always meant to end. From that day forward, Brentwood High continued to change, not in grand, sweeping revolutions, but in small, almost invisible ways. The mocking laughter that had once filled the halls no longer returned. No more students were shoved against lockers just to prove a point. The racial slurs and whispered judgments faded into silence, not because the world had become perfect, but because the courage to speak them aloud had died. Everyone remembered the calm boy who had stood in the storm and refused to break. Jalen, though, never embraced the role of a savior. He didn't wear his victories like medals, didn't let admiration shape the rhythm of his days. He still sought the same thing he had always sought: to live quietly, to breathe in peace. But unknowingly, he had become a symbol, not through violence, but through patience, through control, through a refusal to let hatred define who he was. And in that, he had left a mark no rumor could erase, no bully could undo. Years later, perhaps, the names of those who had once ruled Brentwood High would fade into memory. Brian Harper, once feared, would be remembered only as a boy who lost himself before he found humility. But Jalen Cole, his story would remain. Not because he fought, but because he chose when not to. Not because he defeated others, but because he proved that real strength lies not in overpowering people, but in mastering oneself. And so, Brentwood High was never the same again. Not just because the bully had fallen, but because the entire school had learned a lesson no one could forget. Real strength is quiet, real strength is steady. Real strength does not seek control, it seeks peace. When the dust settled at Brentwood High, what lingered wasn't the memory of fists or the echo of laughter in the courtyard. What remained was the silence, the kind of silence that comes not from fear, but from change. It's easy to mistake strength for dominance. For years, Brian Harper ruled that school because people bowed their heads, not because he had earned their respect. And for just as long, Jalen Cole walked quietly, carrying a strength no one could see until they forced him to reveal it. What Jalen showed us is something most people spend a lifetime learning. Real power isn't in how loud you can shout, or how many people tremble when you walk by. Real power is restraint. It's the ability to master your anger, to know when to hold back and when to stand tall. Anyone can throw a punch, but very few can walk away when hatred demands they strike. That is why Jalen's story matters. He didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he refused to let cruelty define him. He proved that dignity doesn't need applause, and that silence, when chosen, not forced, can be more commanding than noise. And yet, this isn't just about Jalen and Brian. It's about every hallway, every classroom, every street corner where someone is made to feel small. It's about every person who's been told they don't belong, who's been pushed to the edge by words sharper than knives. We may not all have Jalen's training, but we each have the power to decide who we are in the face of injustice. That's the lesson. Strength is not in control over others. It lies in control over yourself. Imagine what schools, workplaces, even whole communities would look like if more people understood that. If we measured power not by the fear we spread, but by the respect we earned through patience, empathy, and self-discipline. Brian's fall was not just the end of a bully, it was the collapse of an illusion that fear equals respect, that intimidation equals leadership. In reality, it only takes one calm voice, one steady presence, to unravel years of false power. So perhaps the question we must all ask ourselves is this: when the moment comes, when the choice is placed before us, will we answer with cruelty or with control? Because the truth is, we each walk our own hallways. We each face our own bullies, whether they're others or the battles within ourselves. And the way we respond shapes not only our lives, but the lives of those who look to us for courage. That's why stories like this one matter. Not because they entertain us, but because they remind us who we are capable of becoming. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a bully or witnessed someone else being treated unfairly? What did you do, or what do you wish you had done? Share your story. Someone out there may need to hear it. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about strength in a different way, join the community we're building here. At Raw Black Stories, every tale is more than a fight. It's a lesson, a mirror, a reminder that we can be better. So stay with us. Add your voice. Because together, we're not just telling stories, we're changing the way they end.